passed, and the question is the motion be agreed. The Honourable Simon O'Brien.
Madam President, I seek the approval of the House to establish a select committee for the purposes outlined. In support of that proposition, may I present the following. The Constitution Act of 1889 provides at section 52 that 1. The legislature shall maintain a system of local governing bodies elected and constituted in such manner as the legislature may from time to time provide. 2. Each elected local governing body shall have such powers as the legislature may from time to time provide, being such powers as the legislature considers necessary for the better government of the area in respect of which the body is constituted. That provision only dates from 1979, but the history of local government in Western Australia predates by a long time. In 1971, the then Department of Local Government published a booklet reflecting on 100 years of local government in Western Australia, and it opens with these fine words. We will never bring disgrace to this our city by any act of dishonesty or cowardice, nor ever desert our suffering comrades in the ranks. We will fight for the ideals and sacred things of the city, both alone and with many. We will revere and obey the city's laws and do our best to incite a like respect in those above us who are prone to annul or set them at naught. We will strive unceasingly to quicken the public sense of civic duty. Thus, in all these ways, we will transmit this city not only, not less, but greater and more beautiful than it was transmitted to us. Madam President, that was an oath sworn by citizens in ancient Athens as they prepared to involve themselves in civic affairs. They don't write them like that anymore. The same booklet also provides this, drawn from the Councillor's Handbook, a publication of the Local Government Association of WA. Local government has been defined as that part of the government of a nation or state which deals mainly with such matters as concern the inhabitants of a particular district or place, and which it is thought desirable should be administered by local authorities subordinate to the central government. I'm moved by that definition's simplicity and brevity, which is something of a lost art as well. If we go back to the earliest days of the Swan River colony and examine civic affairs from then until now, we can see a history of so many of our fellow West Australians committed to working long and hard to improve the community in which they live, whether as elected members or those employed in local government in its many iterations over the years. I want to support those elected members and employees, and I'd like to harness the authority of this Legislative Council to examine the legislative environment we are responsible for creating and maintaining. We should do so to make sure that those many fine and dedicated people are empowered but not unnecessarily encumbered. We are the legislature, which is referred to in the Constitution Act. Indeed, the Legislative Council did provide much of the enabling legislation, and in passing, the Constitution Act of 1889 itself, which established the Legislative Assembly and our bicameral system, which is all very good things. In 1971, we saw the marking of the centenary of the passing of the Municipalities Act and the Road District Act of 1871. The preamble to the latter commenced with this: whereas it is expedient that the inhabitants of the country districts should be empowered to construct and keep in repair the roads and bridges in their respective districts, and that all sums of money devoted to that purpose from the general revenue of the colony or otherwise should, as far as practicable, be expended under local authority and supervision. And whereas it may be necessary that such sums of money should be supplemented by local rates, and it is desirable that such rates should be raised and expended under the authority of district boards by and with the consent of the inhabitants of such districts, as expressed by their representatives elected to such boards, be it enacted. There is a long history of parliamentary support for all of the principles of local government, and that should and must continue in the 21st century. Now, the acts I've just mentioned were amended and later succeeded again and again by sundry other acts. In more recent times, major changes in local government acts demonstrate what an increasingly complex field local government had become. The Local Government Act of 1960, for example, was 13 years in the making, and according to the second reading speech, had several false starts along the way. And this Act was amended many times, not least in 1975 with the celebrated day-door provisions. The Local Government Act 1995, the present Act, has been subject to many amendments over the years, and generally that's been as a result of emerging issues and the evolution of practices in the sector. In this Parliament alone, there have been several amending bills, and I understand that if the government brings it on, there'll be another bill to be dealt with later today. And there have been plenty of reviews of local government too. The government commissioned the Robson Report in 2012. The government also commissioned a Local Government Advisory Board report in 2006. Parliamentary inquiries, there have been several. Public Admin and Finance looked at the rating system and distribution of funds in 2003. The Assembly's Public Accounts Committee had a look at some aspects in 2005-06. Our Legislation Committee here has had bills referred to it, for example, such as the Regional Subsidiaries Bill of 2010. And of course there have been sundry private members' bills over the years. I turn now, though, to the proposed terms of reference for this Select Committee. At this time, there is a process in train whereby a panel has been appointed by the government to review and ultimately rewrite the 1995 Act, and in due course it's proposed that we will see a green bill to that effect. I would have thought, though, that the first thing that should happen is to determine what the community expects of its system of local government before embarking on such a project. A contemplation of what we want local government to look like in the years ahead, to ask questions like what works and what doesn't, to reflect on what local actually means, and then we develop the legislation in its form and substance to reflect all of those aspirations. And so our first term of reference should be to determine whether the Local Government Act 1995 and related legislation is generally suitable in its scope, its construction and its application. And even a cursory examination of the 472-page statute that exists now invites the view that it is overly prescriptive. Now, that view may be rebuttable, but examination of much of the material presented in the very many submissions to the current review does nothing to reassure me about that. The willingness in some quarters to address concerns by making this legislation and all of its subsidiary parts more and more detailed as a way of improving it and making it easier to work with strikes me as counterintuitive. We might discover, in fact, that as a workable statute, this is a pretty good doorstop. The scope of activities of local governments is the second term of reference. Now, the current Act superseded the 1960 Act, but the 1960 Act still lives on. It's been renamed Miscellaneous Provisions, and its current form is dramatically hollowed out from what it once was. It was seen as overly prescriptive itself in 1995, but at least it told local government what they were meant to be attending to. And an examination of some of the context talks about cattle trespass, pounds, pound keepers and rangers, defining what a building is, and all of that sort of bread and butter stuff that one would expect in a local government act. What next, though, for local government? Commercial operations has been mooted. Indeed, the capacity exists in the current Act. I'd suggest that it's a potential minefield that needs to be reconnoitred very carefully. We need to look at the role of the Department of State, which administers the Local Government Act and the related legislation. Madam President, I would submit that it is long overdue for this parliament to examine the department and assess how well it's resourced to carry out its functions, which, judging by the current number of authorised inquiries alone, seems to be onerous. We should also examine the relationship between the department and WELGA. Many of the participants in the sector look to WELGA for guidance and advice, not to the department for the guidance and advice. Is the balance right? We don't know. WELGA does have an important function in supporting its member councils. Indeed, I'm sure if any of us were a shire president or mayor and there wasn't a local government association, we would seek to set one up. But we do want to make sure that the balance is right and to ensure that government is not abrogating any of its necessary responsibilities. A further term of reference, Madam President, that I must declare I have some views about before we start, because as members would know, I have also expressed the view many times that any inquiry has to be a genuine one. So I'll try and put my preconceptions to one side, but I assert in the proposed terms of reference that the role of elected members and chief executive officers and employees, and whether they're clearly defined, delineated, understood and accepted. And I would say to the House that one of the factors that's drawn my attention to these matters in recent years is that these roles are not clearly defined, delineated, understood or accepted. It strikes me as curious that elected members anywhere can find themselves elected and then unable to comment on issues of the day. The Act is not meant to function in this way, one would hope, but in many places it does. It's time for something to be done about that, and that is a responsibility that should, with respect, be picked up by this House. And that's one thing in particular that this Select Committee needs to examine and seek to resolve. It is absolutely unconscionable in a democracy such as Western Australia, let alone ancient Athens, that anyone, particularly in elected office, should be gagged from representing the views of those that elected them.
Order.
I move now, Madam President, to the question of the funding and financial management of local governments. I came across an anecdote from many, many years ago, as I tend to do, about a former iteration of local government, the Perth Town Trust. And back in, I think it was about 1838, some other members might have been there, I wasn't, they set about building a jetty which cost 800 quid, a very substantial price in those days. And the interest, at least, was to be met from tolls paid by those crossing the Swan to arrive at this jetty. Well, it was what, I think it ended up as what the American military would characterise as a limited success. The jetty was opened on November the 7th, 1842, and by the end of July in 1843, only £21.11 and 4pence had been collected in tolls. It gets worse, because that didn't even pay the wages of the bloke that was there to collect the toll. Now, that reflects a different time when we had perhaps a couple of thousand non-Indigenous inhabitants in the colony. We didn't have the infrastructure which had grown over centuries of crisscrossing roads with hamlets or villages at the crossroads. Heck, we didn't have any crossroads. We didn't even have any roads. And so those economies of scale that we witness today, of course, were not present then, and they were great challenges of the time, as that story demonstrates. But I'll tell you this, Madam President, there are many shires out there in our great state that have very small populations and have to take on local government responsibilities for very large areas, including roads. And they do so in very difficult financial circumstances. Someone said colloquially, there's a few shires out in the regions that are only one bad decision away from bankruptcy. And I think we need to shine a light on this and work out how we're all going to pull together to make sure that everybody's interests are preserved. Because one other thing you'll find about all of those shires, you tell them you're going to get a dose of efficiency and we're going to amalgamate you with someone else, and all of those residents, those few residents, they'll push back hard because they value what their shire represents to them, for their capacity for local self-determination and setting of priorities. And that's something we need to be sensitive to. Sometimes we see reports commissioned by governments that turn out into exercises about efficiencies of scale and all the rest of it, but they're actually drawing lines on a map. What we need to never, ever lose sight of, we as elected representatives, local government councillors as elected representatives, are in the people business, not the lines on a map business. So we've always got to be sensitive to that. Regardless, Madam President, it's always prudent, I think, to reassure ourselves as a responsible legislature by measuring the extent or otherwise of financial discipline wherever it's exhibited in any part of the government sector. Indeed, the recent application of the powers of the Auditor-General will be helpful and should be reviewed by the Select Committee. But there's other questions to be explored about the nature of local government funding, the role of the Commonwealth, for example. There's also issues that have been raised about arrangements in connection with insurance for councils. And indeed, there have been some pretty unflinching allegations raised and communicated to members. Whatever the truth of the matter, it does not hurt to examine matters so that we can all be reassured about what the state of play is, and where necessary, to take the appropriate action. The Select Committee is not constrained by its terms of reference in relation to other areas that may be identified as worthy of examination and report. And the reason for that term of reference, Madam President, is because this Select Committee needs to go out and call for submissions so that our community can identify what the issues of concern are. That's the first thing that has to happen, and it will. The Select Committee I propose shall comprise of 5 members, and a number of members have agreed to serve on the Select Committee, and I thank them for that. I hope that all of us, if the motion succeeds, will find this is a great opportunity for those participating members to find out a bit more about the life of our state in all the far corners. Yes, there will be opportunities for travel. We're about that time of year when that reporter on the Sunday Times says that everyone's going to be jetting off to warmer climes. Happens every June. Well, we'll be heading off to northern climes as well, this committee. If I've got anything to do, we need to go to places like Wanneroo. If you're up for it, on a good day we'll go to Melville. We might go to 2J, might go to Menzies, might even go to Yalgoo. Another story about Yalgoo, maybe I'll have time to talk about that. But those briefly are the reasons why I seek the House's concurrence in this matter. I thank members for their interest and I look forward to hearing and participating in the debate.